Okay, so now we're going to move on and talk about different abuses of leadership. So, power means that you have influence over people, and you can use these to make the workplace a better place to be, help your employees be more productive, but supervisors can also use their power to treat subordinates poorly. That includes things like employee harassment, where supervisors demand subordinates to do what they're told with a very punitive style. This can include sexual harassment, ethnic harassment, and so on. We're going to spend a little bit more time talking about sexual harassment. So sexual harassment is basically any behavior of a sexual nature that is unwanted. It adversely affects somebody's employment, it interferes with their ability to do their job, and it creates a hostile work environment. It can include unwelcome sexual advances, unwanted physical contact, offensive language, or jokes of a lewd or sexual nature, repeated requests for dates, and probably most importantly, after all of these things as well, threats of punishment for not complying. Now, what else do we know about sexual harassment? First of all, we know that generally we are more likely to perceive that somebody is a victim of harassment if the victim is in a higher level position in the hierarchy. So if somebody is kind of on the lower end of the totem pole and they're harassed by a boss, people are actually going to be less apt to take it seriously. On the other hand, if a person is higher up in the organization and they get harassed, they're a lot more likely to be taken seriously because of that privilege. And I want to be very clear, sexual harassment is not limited to women. Women are often very likely to experience this, but it can and does happen to men as well. Now let's talk about some of the different ways that we can consider leadership and power. So we're going to talk about a few different models of leadership. So the ways that people have tried to look at leadership and power initially started with, well, what kind of personality traits do you need to be able to have to be a good leader? That was eventually followed with, what kind of behaviors do good leaders engage in? What kind of behaviors do they not engage in? Additionally, under certain conditions. So what's the environment like? And depending on that environment, who's going to be a good leader in this environment? And who's going to be a good leader in a different environment? And what kind of behaviors will be effective in certain environments compared to others? And then how do interactions between leaders and followers affect the behavior of the subordinates? So we're going to talk about each of these different considerations in turn. The first is the trait approach, looking at the traits that make a good leader. So this is based on the idea that some people just have personality traits that make better leaders than others. I'm sure you can think of some students at Cotty, and when you look at them, you go, oh yeah, they're a born leader. But other people you may not. So with this idea that some people make better leaders than others, we can also figure out what the traits of good leaders are. So this presumes that somebody's going to be a good leader in all contexts, and I hope you know that that's probably not the case. So how have people tried to study leadership traits? They've done this very similarly to employee selection. So you identify some leaders, you develop different criteria that's designed to look at personality traits and leadership abilities, and then you assess them. The general findings is that cognitive ability seems to be a really important factor. A lot of other results are really inconsistent. So there's a lot of conflicting data about what personality traits seem to matter, what kind of big five factors seem to matter, and so on. Now, another way that we can look at leadership traits is by looking at what's called leader emergence. So we put people in a group and we basically determine who is going to become the leader. So you put these groups to work on a certain kind of task, and then you figure out who's basically becoming the leader in all of this. And it's part of the reason why I'm kind of bummed that we didn't have in-person classes, because the NASA task is definitely, the Lost on the Moon task or the NASA task is definitely one of those cases where we end up seeing a lot of leader emergence in those cases. Now, when people have looked at leader emergence, again, the findings are pretty inconsistent, but we do tend to find that emotional stability, so being low in neuroticism, high extroversion, high openness to experience, and conscientiousness are going to play a pretty huge role. So next we're going to talk about the leader behavior approach. So we've already talked about the personality trait approach, what traits make a good leader, and in general the answer is, well, it depends. That assumes that all leaders are good in all contexts, and I don't necessarily think that that's true. The leader behavior approach concerns what leaders do rather than what traits they have. So there's an emphasis on a leadership style, the cluster of related behaviors that basically constitutes how people tend to deal with their subordinates. So for example, if we're looking at a participative leadership style, we're looking at behaviors where leaders are basically trying to involve subordinates in decision making. They're taking their thoughts into account as they make these processes. Compare that to something like an autocratic leadership style where subordinates are not really consulted. Rather, the leader is going to make decisions and they don't necessarily need the input from their subordinates to do so. That froze up. Wait. There we go. Okay, so a few ways that people have looked at this include the Ohio Leadership Studies by Kurt Levine and colleagues. Basically, what they ended up doing was a factor analysis. So for those who may not know, a factor analysis is kind of a statistical process, a statistical technique, where you basically give leaders or in this case, you're basically looking at all of these different behaviors of leaders to see what kind of stands out, and you basically group them into these clusters or factors. So an example of factor analysis, it's kind of a hokey example, but it tends to explain how factor analysis works pretty well. Let's say I gave you a list of items at the grocery store, and I kind of randomly scrambled all of the different so I have like bread, milk, grapes, apples, butter, and so on. So I basically group all of those different list items into bigger factors. Like, these are my dairy foods. I need to go to the dairy aisle for this. These are my fruits. I need to go to the produce aisle for these. So that's kind of what factor analysis is. You take these different behaviors or different measures and you lump them together in different factors. We also do this when we look at things like IQ. So two major leadership dimensions really stood out. First is what is called consideration. The second is known as initiating structure. So consideration is basically the amount of concern that supervisors show for the happiness and the well-being of their subordinates. This can include friendly and supportive behaviors. So that's the first factor, consideration. Initiating structure is basically the extent to which the supervisor defines his or her role and makes very clear what is expected of subordinates. So in general, these are two big dimensions that tend to stand out. One of the things that we find is that we like kind of a moderate level of initiating structure. We don't like being micromanaged, but we generally don't like people being really hands-off with us either. And we also tend to prefer a sizable level of consideration. So these seem to be the two factors that really play a role. So how do each of these affect behavior? And this has largely been tested by the Leader Behavior Description Questionnaire. And this was studied by Fleischman and Harris in 1962 to look at grievances and turnover rates. So the Leader Behavior Description Questionnaire, if you go to your book on page 334, Hi, remember this is your book. If you go to page 334 in your book, you'll actually see a list of items from the LBDQ. So here are some items that actually test for consideration. He or she is friendly and approachable. He or she does little things to make it pleasant to be a member of the group. He or she puts suggestions made by the group into operation. He or she treats all members of the group as his or her equals. Initiating structure items look like this. He or she lets group members know what's expected of them. He or she encourages the use of uniform procedures. He or she tries out his or her ideas in the group. He or she makes his or her attitudes clear to the group. So we need both of those to some extent. Generally, we tend to find that the greatest amount of turnover and more grievances tend to be associated with low consideration. So you don't really consider the well-being of your employees. You don't really care about their well-being or their happiness. And high initiating structure. You let them know what is expected of them so much that it's basically like you're micromanaging them. Generally, supervisors that were lowest in consideration tended to have a turnover rate that was 4 times highest in terms of consideration. So basically the turnover rate for the supervisors that had low consideration was 4 times higher those that were considerably higher in consideration in this case. So what this tells us is that participative leadership can be really effective. So this can be linked to higher job performance, higher job satisfaction. Participative leadership does have a certain amount of consideration because you are actually getting your subordinates involved in the process. But this relationship is not always a strong one. And part of that is because it depends on the extent of the participation that you're expecting people to be involved in. What kind of change should be made versus whether there should be a change at all. One of those is going to have much more participation than the other. Whether a change should be made will have less participation than what kind of change. And so depending on those circumstances, you might see some differences in relationships between job performance and job satisfaction. In addition, this can interact with leader characteristics and behavior. So it's not always that simple. Well, next time is here. Let's go. So we're going to talk about leadership approaches now. We're going to talk about contingency theory, path goal theory, LMX theory, transformational leadership, and something called the Vroom-Yatton model. And we'll talk about women in leadership. So we're going to start by looking at some of these other leadership approaches that are more complicated than just looking at the traits or just looking at the behavior. So Fiedler's contingency theory is basically the idea that, like all human behavior that we see, it is a function of the person and the situation that you find yourself in. In particular, situational control seems to be a big part of this. So if situational control is how much influence and power you have over your coworkers, there are 3 different things that basically bring that about. And they include the following: task structure, position power, and leader-group relations. So task structure looks a lot like initiating structure. It's basically, do the subordinates know what tasks they have to do? Are their roles well defined? Have the tasks been clearly defined? Position power is basically the amount of power or influence that the supervisor has. So especially with respect to reward and punishment. And leader-group relations is basically how well subordinates actually get along with their supervisors. So those are the situational aspects that can affect leadership ability. Generally, here are where the personal characteristics come in. Generally, the leader should try to modify the situation to fit their own style. And generally, when we're assessing the personality characteristics of the leader, we assess this with what is called the least preferred coworker scale. So the idea here is that with the least preferred coworker scale, we ask a leader, what is the most difficult situation that you've ever had with a coworker or a subordinate? And the idea is that whatever you don't like will tell them, the assessors, something about what you value in a subordinate or in a coworker, and it will also explain your leadership style. So in your book on page 337, they actually give you some sample items. So basically the idea behind this is you're given two opposite adjectives, pleasant or unpleasant, for example, and you have to indicate where that least preferred coworker, the coworker you've had the most difficult time with, would fit on that scale. Friendly or unfriendly, rejecting or accepting, tense or relaxed. So I would generally tend to find, for example, if I filled this out, that if I had to bring in my a least preferred coworker that I've worked with at any point in my life, they would be pretty high on unpleasant. They'd be pretty high on unfriendly. They'd be pretty high on rejecting versus accepting, and they would be pretty high on tense, which kind of tells you what I value compared to what this person was. So if I have a difficult time with somebody who's unpleasant, unfriendly, rejecting, and tense, this probably suggests that I have a pretty high participative style, that I prefer people who are pleasant and friendly and accepting and relaxed. Despite the fact that I myself am not relaxed. But the idea is that what you don't prefer tells us about what you value. So at least according to Fiedler's model, basically how you rate on this least preferred coworker scale will basically intermingle with situational control to basically explain what kind of situations you will do best in and what types of situations you will do worst in. So you'll see a figure that kind of looks like this. Let's talk a little bit about what this means. So we've got these three components that I mentioned for situational control. Are the tasks well defined? Has your position, basically, do you have a lot of influence? And are relationships with your subordinates good? So that will basically create situational control that varies from low to high. So low might be a case where you don't have a lot of task structure, you don't really get along with your subordinates, and you don't really have a lot of power over them. High is you have a lot of task structure, you get along with your subordinates, and you do have influence and power over them. What this is going to tell us is that certain types of leaders work better under certain situations. So if we have a situation with low situational control, people with low PLC tend to do better than people with high PLC. Somebody who's very engaged with their subordinates is going to have a hard time in a situation where there's not a lot of situational control. People may not necessarily like them. They may not necessarily be very pleasant, and the roles aren't very clearly defined. In moderate situational control, we'll tend to find that high LPC tend to do a little bit better. Interestingly enough, high LPCs do not do very well under situations of high situational control. We actually find that low LPC people do that. So we get these situations where the situation affects the kind of leader that you are, as does your personality traits and your behaviors. So the person taking the test, as I mentioned, is being assessed, not the coworker. High is basically being associated with relationship motivation, so you care about people. Low LPC is associated more being focused on the task rather than being focused on the people. Now, let's move on to talking about path goal theory. So according to path goal theory, it's very much like Fiedler's contingency theory, but it's much more complex. In this case, it looks a lot like VI, that motivational theory that we talked about before, because our leader's behavior is contingent upon the motivation, the performance, and the satisfaction of the subordinates. So what exactly does all of this mean? So there are basically these very, very different supervisory styles. There are what are called directive or path goal clarifying, achievement oriented, participative, and supportive. So we basically started with autocratic versus participative styles, and generally we are going to find that it's more complex than that. So a directive or a path goal clarifying type of leadership is basically very much like initiating structure. It's all about structuring tasks for subordinates and letting them know what you expect. Achievement oriented is based on emphasizing achievement, good performance, making challenging task goals, emphasizing high standards of performance. Participative is much like seeking input from your subordinates, allowing them in your decision-making processes. And the supportive style looks a lot like consideration, considering the well-being and the needs of your subordinates. Now, what's interesting is that it's really easy when you hear about these different styles to be like, well, I'm directive, I'm participative, I'm supportive. But the truth of the matter is that your style varies on the situation that you find yourself in. So there are certain situations where I find myself in a more supportive position of leadership, and there are other times where I absolutely have to be directive and say, okay, we need to do this. This is something that needs to be done, and we all need to get on board. So the style can be changed as the situation requires, but these styles are contingent and can be modified by subordinate behavior as well as the workplace environment. Leader-member exchange theory is the next one we're going to talk about. And this is another case where we see that leadership behavior is contingent upon something. In this case, leadership is an interaction between the supervisor and the subordinate. So one of the things that we'll find with LMX theory is that things can happen known as differentiation. So generally, we know that depending on the supervisor may have what is called an in-group, and they may have an out-group. So they may have a favored group of employees, and they may have another group that is not favored. Now, partially, this is based on employee confidence. I have been on the out group in certain circumstances, and it wasn't because I wasn't incompetent. There are a variety of different reasons. It's only partially based on competence. It could be based on similarity to the leader, or things like that. And generally, we're going to find that the more of this differentiation that you see between your employees, the more that you're going to find some polarization in terms of how people feel about their supervisor. So generally, people who tend to be in the in-group, they feel pretty good. They feel really satisfied with their jobs. They tend to believe they have a better relationship with the boss compared to people who are in that out-group. Generally, you want to try to make sure as much as possible that you're not doing this differentiation, because you can often find that if there is that differential treatment, that's going to contribute to an environment of favoritism, and we are going to see things like turnover issues, poor job satisfaction, and so on. So the in-group will often be more satisfied. Generally, supervisors that do their best to improve relationships are going to have more satisfied employees, whether they're in the in-group or out-group. Generally, the more that you work to develop relationships and make sure that those relationships are good, whether you like that employee and they're in the in-group or they're not, the better off everybody is going to be. So this is a type of leadership theory that we talk about here at CAUTI. This is what is known as transformational leadership. And the emphasis here is leadership through inspiration and charisma, this certain style that you have that has a lot of influence and charm over people. And there are 4 different components to transformational leadership. First, we have idealized influence. The leader is an ideal role model for followers. Inspirational motivation. They actually do have the ability to inspire, encourage, and motivate. Individualized consideration. They don't treat everybody the same. They treat each person like an individual with their own needs, and they pay personal attention to each of their followers. And intellectual stimulation. We do actually challenge followers to be creative and innovative. So what's interesting about transformational leadership is this role that charisma plays. And we do know that supervisor charisma does have a relationship to job performance, satisfaction, and organizational citizenship behaviors. Thankfully, there's evidence that charisma can be trained. Unfortunately, it's not like The Sims where you can just sit and give speeches in the mirror just for hours on end. Charisma has to be trained in different ways. Now, I realize we've kind of gone over time a little bit, so I'm going to stop here. We're going to take a look at this complicated, scary model known as the Vroom-Yetton model next time.